Instantly establishing central pawn influence, d4 stakes a claim for space and prepares for rapid piece development. Developing a knight towards the center immediately challenges white's central pawn and prepares for further piece activity. Seizing central territory, this pawn thrust asserts immediate dominion over key squares and prepares for swift piece development. Opening the door for the queen's bishop, this solidifies the center and prepares for development without sacrificing pawn structure. Developing the knight here neatly prepares for castling, while reinforcing the d4 pawn's central presence. Embracing the queen's Indian, black opts for a flexible structure, ready to fianchetto the bishop and exert influence on the long diagonal. Reinforcing the center, nc3 develops a piece while maintaining flexibility and controlling key squares. Developing the bishop to its longest diagonal immediately adds pressure along the c8h3 diagonal, setting up a potential queenside castling scenario. Introducing immediate pressure on the knight, this pin subtly hints at future tactical skirmishes and aims to hinder black's queenside development. Developing the bishop to a central square bolsters the kingside pawn structure and prepares for castling, a sensible defensive maneuver. Solidifying the center and preparing for kingside castling, this quiet maneuver subtly bolsters white's pawn structure while maintaining flexibility. Notice how the e3 pawn now supports the d4 pawn and opens a diagonal for the queen. A strategic redeployment of the knight, initiating a lively dance on the dark squares and directly challenging the bishop pair's influence while subtly preparing to undermine white's central pawn structure. Sacrificing a bishop immediately after black's knight arrives at e4 often signals a desire to disrupt black's coordination and open lines, even at the cost of piece activity, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses around the weakened dark squares. Recapturing with the queen re-establishes material equality, but it also exposes the monarch to potential threats as the queen is now on a central square, potentially drawing fire. This centralization, while active, might invite further complications if white can exploit the open lines. Exchanging knights clears the center and sets up potential pawn breaks for white, simplifying the position while black's bishop pair advantage becomes slightly less potent in this more open structure. Recapturing the knight immediately resolves the tension in the center, clearing the way for the bishop to become a more active piece, though it also opens up the e-file for potential enemy infiltration later on. This knight's relocation opens a path for the queen's rook, subtly preparing to contest the central files and potentially unleash pressure against black's slightly cramped queenside. Re-anchoring the bishop to its newly acquired diagonal prepares for an eventual pawn push on the queenside, simultaneously reinforcing the king's safety by developing another piece towards the center and offering a potential retreat square for the queen if needed. Preparing to castle and solidify the kingside, while simultaneously opening the diagonal for the queen's bishop, hints at a flexible middle-game plan where white aims to develop harmoniously before committing to aggressive action. Exposing the queen so early on g5 invites a sharp counterattack, potentially sacrificing material for initiative as white's pieces are poised to swarm the center. Repositioning the bishop to f3 aims to bolster the kingside defense, creating a safer haven for the king and simultaneously eyeing the central squares, particularly e4. This subtle maneuver prevents black from immediately exploiting the bishop's prior placement on b7, forcing a reassessment of their tactical ambitions and potentially opening avenues for white's own offensive buildup. The bishop's sacrifice of itself for a knight unlocks crucial central space, allowing black's queen a freer path to influence the kingside and prepare for potential pawn advances. Capturing the bishop on f3 finally clarifies the pawn structure, opening the queen's diagonal and preparing for potential kingside pressure. This exchange, while simplifying, also hands white a central pawn majority and potentially frees up their own king for an earlier castling sequence. Developing the knight to c6 solidifies black's central presence and prepares for potential pawn advances like d5, while also offering a defensive pawn shield for the king. Unleashing a potent attacking initiative, this queen sortie aims to disrupt black's defensive harmony, eyeing vulnerable pawns and potentially opening lines towards the enemy monarch. The queen's repositioning isn't just about immediate threats. It's a calculated move to increase pressure on the kingside, creating future tactical possibilities and forcing black to constantly reassess their defensive setup. It's a proactive stance, seeking to dictate the game's rhythm and deny black comfortable development. Exchanging queens here simplifies the position considerably, ushering in an endgame where black's bishop pair might offer some long-term compensation for the potentially compromised pawn structure on the kingside. Opening the h-file with this pawn advance immediately disrupts black's intended piece placement, creating a subtle but persistent pressure along that flank for future operations. The black king ventures out early, seeking a more active role in the developing middle game, a bold choice that could open pathways for counterplay but simultaneously exposes it to potential checks and aggressions along the central files. Solidifying control of the kingside space, white pushes the g-pawn to create an advanced outpost and potentially restrict black's knight mobility, simultaneously preparing for further expansion or pawn breaks that could open lines toward the enemy king. Although this aggressive posture does come with the inherent risk of weakening the pawn shield in front of white's own monarch. Preventing immediate kingside pawn advances opens up the potential for piece maneuvering, aiming to consolidate black's somewhat cramped position. This move h6 subtly addresses the lurking threat of g5, a pawn push that could otherwise curtail the mobility of the knight on c6 and potentially expose the king later. It's a proactive defensive measure, creating a necessary airspace for the pieces while acknowledging the strategic importance of the kingside in this pawn-heavy middle game. While it does create a slight weakness on g6 should white eventually break through, it's a reasonable trade-off to avoid more immediate positional concessions. The focus now shifts to finding active squares for the queenside pieces and contesting central influence. Securing the queenside pawn structure with the pawn advance preemptively addresses any potential for black's knight or bishop to infiltrate along the b4 or c3 squares later, whilst also denying them that scope and subtly reinforcing white's territorial claims in that sector. Solidifying the queenside and preventing potential pawn breaks like b5 is the aim here, though it does cede a touch of dynamism on that wing for improved pawn structure, perhaps anticipating a slow buildup where queenside space becomes paramount. The king's centralization here signals an immediate intent to engage in the endgame, prioritizing activity over passivity, a stark contrast to black's somewhat cumbersome development and the exposed nature of his monarch. A quiet regrouping effort commences, aiming to establish central pawn control and prepare for queenside expansion with the rook. Initiating a knight maneuver to control key central squares, this repositioning aims to free the bishop on c1 and potentially support a d4-d5 pawn thrust later, subtly exerting pressure on black's somewhat passive position. Opening the queenside flank aggressively, black seeks to disrupt white's pawn structure and gain active counterplay on the b-file. Unleashing a pawn storm on the queenside, white seeks to rupture black's defenses and seize control of the open c-file, potentially creating weaknesses around the king later in the game by forcing pawn exchanges. Black challenges the central pawn chain, creating an immediate pawn majority on the queenside and aiming to pry open the c-file for potential queenside pressure. Exploiting the passed pawn's potential, white initiates a decisive exchange that will rip open lines and strain black's king position. Reclaiming the central pawn allows black to immediately break white's attacking pawn chain and establish a more balanced pawn structure on the queenside, opening lines for potential counterplay. Unleashing a central pawn thrust, white aims to shatter black's nascent pawn chain and wrest open the f-file for immediate pressure. Liberating the c8 rook from its passive post, this maneuver immediately pressures the isolated pawn on c5, a key weakness created by white's earlier central pawn push. Initiating counterplay on the queenside, black intends to exploit the potential for pawn breaks and create dynamic imbalances, forcing white to address threats rather than consolidate. Seeking to activate dormant pieces, the rook's journey to the center signifies black's intention to join the fray, aiming to connect with other units and exert influence. Probing white's central structure, This move hints at a desire to unravel the pawn chain and create open lines for its rooks, potentially leading to an open game. A strategic decision to contest the open c-file, Black prepares to challenge White's control and establish its own presence, a vital step in queenside maneuvering. Opening the f-file with initiative, this aggressive pawn thrust aims to disrupt Black's defensive structure and create attacking opportunities against the potentially exposed king. The knight embarks on a daring journey, venturing deep into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt White's pawn chain and potentially outflank the king. This aggressive maneuver creates immediate tension, forcing White to reconsider their territorial ambitions on the queenside and demanding a precise defensive response to prevent the knight from becoming a dominant force. The monarch now ventures from its shelter, seeking to activate its dormant power and potentially join the fray or bolster a threatened flank. Sensing an opportunity to disrupt White's already fractured queenside pawn structure, Black aims to solidify their presence on the c-file and potentially create a passed pawn. This foray of the knight aims to exploit the weakness created by the pawn exchange on d6, seeking active squares and forcing White to address the immediate pressure, possibly leading to a more favorable endgame for Black if White's king remains exposed. Stabilizing the queenside pawn structure after the aggressive c5 push is the immediate objective, reinforcing the queenside majority and preventing Black's knight from finding better squares. Pushing the d-pawn here aims to disrupt White's pawn structure and potentially open lines for Black's pieces, but it also creates a permanent weakness on e5 for White to target if Black isn't careful with the subsequent king activity. Initiating a pawn advance on the queenside offers White a chance to exploit the closed nature of the central position, creating potential weaknesses for Black to defend. This maneuver, 25, rc6, aims to untangle the rook from its cramped position, offering it more mobility and preparing for potential activity on the c-file, while simultaneously reinforcing the d5 pawn and setting up a defensive structure against White's encroaching knight. Opening the f-file here forces Black to decide whether to recapture with the pawn, creating an isolated doubled pawn, or to exchange material, which would give White a passed pawn. This pawn exchange is the immediate consequence of your action, potentially initiating a significant shift in the pawn structure and offering new avenues for attack. Embracing the inevitable pawn structure shift, this recapture solidifies Black's central foothold and opens lines for the rook. Unleashing the pawn storm on the kingside, White aims to shatter Black's defensive shell and create immediate attacking chances. This aggressive push forces a reassessment of Black's king's safety, which has become increasingly exposed after the pawn structure on the kingside was compromised earlier in the game. The advance of the g-pawn is a calculated risk, potentially opening lines for White's pieces while also creating potential weaknesses that Black might exploit if the attack falters. The dynamic nature of this position is heightened, demanding precise calculation from both sides. Opening the h-file now dramatically alters the positional landscape, creating a direct avenue towards your king and demanding immediate attention to defensive coordination. This piece's repositioning aims to seize control of the now open files, threatening to invade Black's territory and dismantle its already compromised pawn structure. Watch for potential sacrifices that could unlock powerful attacking lines against the exposed Black king. The Black king ventures out of its protective pawn wall, aiming to find active squares and potentially participate in the pawn skirmishes opening on the queen's side. Shifting the rook to the third rank prepares to contest the critical open file, aiming to activate this piece and potentially create pressure on Black's somewhat exposed monarch. Pushing the rook to the open c-file immediately intensifies pressure along that crucial vertical, aiming to exploit the potential weakness created by Black's doubled pawns and the exposed king. A knight's journey to the queenside commences, aiming to exploit the open lines now gracing the board, though the king's exposed position on e2 remains a tactical focal point to be mindful of. Probing for weaknesses on the queenside, Black seeks to expand their influence and perhaps create an outpost for their knight, a strategic maneuver aiming to counterbalance White's kingside presence. Unleashing a disruptive check, this action forces Black's king into a potentially precarious situation, seeking to disrupt the opponent's coordinated pieces and exploit the open g-file. Relocating the king to the more open side of the board amidst a potential king hunt adds a crucial layer of defensive security, aiming to connect the remaining pieces for a more unified counterplay. This g4 push creates a precarious pawn chain on the king side, potentially opening lines for black's pieces and complicating white's king's safety, while also aiming to restrict black's knight from its ideal squares. The knight's repositioning to d6 aims to challenge white's central pawn control and potentially disrupt the pawn chain. This maneuver also seeks to gain space and prepare for further dynamic play, perhaps by supporting a pawn advance on the queen side or by redeploying to a more active square like e4 or c4. Notice how black is trying to create counterplay in a somewhat cramped position. The knight recenters to a more dynamic outpost, aiming to harass the black pieces and exploit the weakened kingside pawns. Opening a critical diagonal for the queen to potentially penetrate the white defenses, while simultaneously aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create dynamic counterplay. Opening the a-file immediately offers a dynamic counterplay against black's advanced queenside pawns, forcing a response and potentially disrupting their coordination. Opening the b-file is a crucial step, forcing white's rook to either defend or retreat, potentially creating a dynamic where black can target the queen's pawn further down the line. Repositioning the knight to d1 offers a nuanced, if passive, attempt to untangle white's pieces, aiming to redeploy it to a more active square like c3 or e3, thereby bolstering the kingside defense and potentially supporting a future kingside pawn advance. This is a dynamic defensive maneuver, bringing the rook to a more active position on the open c-file, threatening to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create counterplay along the ranks. It also eyes the vulnerable d-pawn, aiming to exploit any weakness there. The rook endeavors to secure a more menacing position on the second rank, potentially threatening squares like f7 or even aiming to infiltrate further down the open files if opportunities arise. Suddenly, the pawn storm intensifies on the queen side, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create an immediate outpost for black's knight. The rook's relocation to the first rank aims to bolster the pawn structure's defense and potentially generate counterplay on the queen side, creating a vital defensive pivot. Seizing the open file with the knight offers a lifeline, albeit a temporary one, disrupting white's planned pawn storm and hinting at a desperate counterattack before white's rook and pawn wall on the queen side solidify further. Reactivating the rook along the second rank offers the possibility of supporting the threatened knight and preparing a central pawn push with f5, a promising avenue for regaining initiative in this complex position. Reclaiming the open c-file after white's tentative rook repositioning is a sound strategic priority for black, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and pressure the d-file's advanced passed pawn. Asserting dominance over the open files becomes paramount now, with the rook transferred to the b-file to directly challenge black's control and potentially set up a queenside bind. Unleashing a central pawn push aims to disrupt white's coordination and inject life into black's cramped position, potentially opening lines for the rook on the c-file or creating dynamic counterplay on the queen side. The rook's repositioning to the open file signals a crucial shift, aiming to exploit the isolated pawn and potential weaknesses on the queen side, hinting at a looming queenside initiative or a clever maneuver to dislodge black's knight. Unleashing a formidable pincer movement, black aims to exploit the open files and pressure white's king, threatening to overwhelm the queenside defenses and unravel white's coordination. The rook's repositioning to the seventh rank signals a potent threat to black's vulnerable pawn structure, aiming to exploit the potential weakness on the c-file should black's defenses falter. The knight's sudden leap to c5 opens a critical diagonal, forcing the white rook to abandon its post on a1 and opening up opportunities for immediate counterplay.